No, I don't think it's recording. Ah, hear that?
Great. So
Great.
we're good now. Share my screen.
Great. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. So thank you very much for your patience and for inviting me to speak on this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. So this talk is based on my third book, which is published with NYU Press, and it came out in 2021 now, I think. So it's very, very cool that I get to present this research, which actually was in the making since about 2017. And just if you're interested, like why, I'm gonna say right now, obviously I'm an American, so why me as an American writing on this topic? Well, two main reasons. One of them being that at the time when I started writing on this, researching for this project, I was living in Cork, Ireland, and I was invited to write a chapter on just animal rights in Ireland for an encyclopedia project. It's a vegan studies encyclopedia project, which actually didn't come through. And I did find when I was writing this chapter, there was way more than I could possibly fit into that chapter, because for the second reason why I wrote this book, this is really an untold history. There are a few books that have come out since I started this research that's now starting to fill those gaps. But as someone who specializes in the history of animal rights mobilization in the West, I was really quite shocked that there was this really, really rich history of animal rights work in Ireland. But many people weren't aware of that. Certainly fellow Americans didn't know. And now I live in England, and I know that's a history that's really not known here either. So Ireland was just this kind of little forgotten country in the middle between these two powerhouses of the United States and England, who are, of course, very famous for a lot of cutting edge animal rights work over the past 2 centuries. So this was my effort, really, to bring a spotlight to some of those awesome things that Ireland has to contribute to that story. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a quiz. And if you want to pipe in, you're welcome to, or you just kind of think to yourself or write in the chat. But I'm going to introduce a few key figures in Irish animal rights history. And just ask yourself, are you familiar with any of these folks? Let's see. So the first one is Richard Martin. Actually, when I put this presentation together last year, I was willing to bet that a lot of people would not know who Richard Martin is. But the Cultural Arts and Animal Rights Culture Foundation, I can't remember the exact name, that Tom Reagan founded, who's now passed on, they have recently they've sponsored a podcast series on the history of animal rights in the West, and it starts out with Martin's Law. So Martin's Law was proposed by Richard Martin, who was an MP from Galway. And he was involved in a lot of social justice work, but he also had a particular compassion for non-human animals who, of course, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, really had no protection at all. And so with the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act in 1822, for the first time, we had meaningful legislation to protect non-human animals. It says cattle, but back then cattle meant livestock in general. Unfortunately, this brought a lot of backlash to him. So there's a lot of artwork from the time contemporary to when he was. It actually kind of makes fun of him for taking concern over non-human animal welfare. Sometimes he would even bring in abused animals into court spaces to prove that these animals had been abused, such as the one where they're kind of making fun of that in this painting here on the presentation. But yeah, I would also say that although this was one of the first meaningful acts of legislation to protect non-human animals, and of course this would go on to spawn the formation of the SPCA. And again, that's very important because this was an Irish MP who instigated this. Actually, the very first animal rights laws took place in Ireland way back in the 1600s under British colonization, which is a theme we're going to review later in this talk. Unfortunately, those particular early laws, one of them was penalizing people who would pull hair from sheep, which was thought to be cruel. And another one was where Irish farmers had this practice of tying plows to horses' tails. Whether or not it actually took place, that's a bit debated, but Piers Byrne has actually written a little bit on this. And the idea behind it was that Irish farmers would protect their plows by tying it to horses' tails so that they would be more sensitive to rocks and not break the plow. And the practice was supposed to be prevalent because farmers couldn't afford to change out their equipment anyway. So long story short, it actually ended up being a sort of a taxation. So this was an early form of really of Irish oppression, of like making money out of Irish people for the British Crown. So this history of animal rights, the actual legislation of animal rights, its home has always been in Ireland, although I think a lot of animal rights activists and leaders today aren't really aware of that. So got to shout out to Richard Martin. Here's one that maybe you don't know. Has anyone heard of William Hamilton Drummond? I see some head shaking. Yeah. So this one was one, this is when I found this out, this is one of the things, is like, I've got to write a book now because I know that people are not going to be familiar with this fascinating history. So he's actually well known, well, maybe not well known, but remembered for those who are aware of him for his naturalism in Ireland. He wrote, as part of that Romantic period, and he wrote very much so about interesting like landscapes, and he was interested in natural sciences and things like that. But what most people don't know, and I think if you look on his Wikipedia page, I don't even think that's on there, and I had to really dig for this, he's actually one of the first people to write a book on animal rights theory. And he wrote an essay in the 1830s for a contest for the newly formed SPCA that good old Richard Martin had a lot to do with starting. And he, I think, just barely missed the deadline for that, but his colleagues encouraged him to go on and publish it anyway. And so this came out in 1838, and you might say, oh, well, this is some obscure, piece or whatever. But actually, it was relatively well known and influential. For instance, abolitionists in the United States, William Lloyd Garrison, met him and received a copy of this book. And in his notes, he comments on how he just really lights up by this idea of the rights of animals. And so this is, this demonstrates this intersectional sort of awareness that activists had at the time. And again, this was an Irish author. And so we think about Henry Salt and other authors of the 19th century, but really, I don't think many of us know about the early work of, again, a forgotten Irish person. Frances Power Cobbs, some of you may have heard of her before. Yeah. But again, a lot of people in the animal rights movement who don't know their history will not be familiar with her. She was an Anglo-Irish woman, and she really was a powerhouse of the vivisection movement, the anti-vivisection movement in Britain. And she started the British Union for Anti-Vivisection, which is now called Cruelty Free International. So that organization has been around for over a century, right? And she formed that. She also was responsible for hundreds and hundreds of essays and pamphlets that were written on animal rights, some with really graphic imagery in it to really wake up people to what was happening to all manner of species in these new science labs and medical institutes, because it was completely unregulated. You could basically do anything you wanted to non-human animals. The idea that they were sentient and they could suffer was still under debate. For a lot of political reasons, it was problematic. It also challenged a lot of the religious kind of belief systems at the time. But anyway, so she worked really hard to get the 1876 Act to go through, and then to her absolute horror, instead of making it more difficult for people to test on animals, it actually kind of legitimated it, gave it an air of credibility. And she was really quite disgusted by that. And from then on says, I'm not at all interested in moderating vivisection. I'm for the total abolition of vivisection. And so then she founded the National Anti-Vivisection Society, which again is also still a continuation today. And there's a powerful little Irish lady for two of the most important animal rights organizations, and one of the first animal rights pieces of animal rights legislation that we have. So again, many, many thanks to some of the really inspirational work that Irish men and women have been doing. Charlotte Despard, has anyone heard of her? Some, maybe. Charlotte Despard is another kind of Anglo-Irish woman. She spent a lot of time in Ireland. She also lived in the Battersea area of London. She was also very heavily involved in the anti-vivisection movement. She was also involved in Irish nationalism, the Vegetarian Society in London. She was a suffragette. And I can also credit her. She's part of the largest animal rights protest to date. Happened in the early 1900s. The brown dog statue was put up in the Battersea area, and that was done to commemorate all the suffering that was still taking place in medical laboratories and educational facilities. But it was an intentional choice to put it in Battersea. She didn't just put it anywhere. She put it in a place that had a lot of socialist agitation, a lot of feminists, and importantly, there were a lot of Irish folks living there and Irish nationalists. And so again, I think this is really interesting, as it demonstrates that intersectional awareness that early activists of that era had. But again, who was behind this amazing protest? And if you don't know about the Brown Dog Affair, it's really worth reading up about, because it's really fascinating. There was basically wars taking place where medical students, mostly male medical students, were coming down and trying to tear down the statue. And then the anti-vivisectionists and the Irish nationalists would kind of fight them back. And then eventually the police were like, we can't afford to manage these anymore. And so the statue was taken away. And then they all went to Trafalgar Square and protested. And at that time, it was the largest animal rights protest. George Bernard Shaw was also present, the very famous Irish playwright who was a vegetarian and animal rights activist. And so again, Irish folks were very much at the heart of these early protests. And you can kind of imagine why, because this kind of entitlement to bodies, this danger and vulnerability that these bodies have, that non-human animal bodies, it resonated with Irish people, who also were very cognizant of their vulnerability under the English system, under British rule. And in fact, sometimes they would also be subject to cruel medical procedures, and a lot of women, enslaved women as well. So that there was an actual connection there with vivisection. Has anyone heard of Jack McClellan? Yes, I thought so. Okay. Jack McClellan is a Northern Irish fellow. And he's one, I had never heard of this guy either. But when I was working on another project about the history of the Vegan Society, one of the cool things that the Vegan Society does is every single journal that they've ever published since the 1940s is up online for you to peruse. And so I went through all those issues and found actually there's a lot of Irish folks who are working really, really hard to promote veganism and animal rights globally, as well as in Britain and in Ireland. But Jack McClellan is a really, really peculiar case. If you want to learn more about him, I've written an essay about him for the Vegan Society. I think they published it earlier this year. So you can go find that online and read a little more about him. But he was extremely involved in the Vegan Society. But in his era, in the 1950s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, he was kind of an all-around athlete. He got his start doing boxing in Belfast. So that's kind of what got his rise to fame. In fact, somebody found my article about him earlier this year. He was working on the history of boxing in Belfast, and said even he wasn't aware of this, and he was kind of interested to learn about this other side of him. So then he kind of got into long distance swimming, and he would do these amazing feats like swimming Galway Bay. I think it was when he swam Galway Bay, more people were said to come and watch him than came when John F. Kennedy visited Ireland, which is like a major thing. Like, I think the only thing to beat that was when the Pope came in the 80s. So Jack McClellan would do these amazing feats, but the cool thing about it is he was completely 100% vegan, which is really unheard of, right? The Vegan Society had only been around since the 1940s. People had been vegan since the 1800s, consciously vegan since the 1800s, but we didn't have a lot of nutritional science. So Jack McClellan would actually, as an athlete, he would use his own body to experiment on the power of plant nutrition. So he ate a lot of seaweed. He was like a big supporter of Irish seaweed. He would eat lots of other kind of like pulses and whole grains and things. And he was so excited by this new like frontier of vegan athleticism, which now is becoming a huge market, as we know. But back then it was completely experimental. He decided to open up a whole health food chain, which we're up in Northern Ireland. And it's kind of funny, like I was looking up just to see where it was located. And today, one of the first one that he created in Belfast is now, I think there's a butcher shop. So he would be rolling in his grave. But anyway, he was very, very important for running the Vegan Society, but also starting vegan organizations in Northern Ireland. And then he later retired in Spain. So he's a very, very cool dude. He was a vegan athlete before we knew what vegan athletes were. This is a real trailblazer. Another thing I wanted to point out, I think this will be my last one before we jump into the kind of the meaty part of this lecture, is the history of direct action. So I know that one of the more important parts of modern day activism was this idea of direct action, where, you know, kind of breaking away from those more traditional approaches of advocacy with, you know, pursuing legislation, building big charities and donation drives and all that. So in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, you see a rise in the Animal Liberation Front and other like organizations, Band of Mercy, led by folks like Ronnie Lee. Well, I actually emailed Ronnie Lee when I was researching for this book and asked him what was up with direct action over in Ireland. So Ronnie Lee lives in England. And he says, really, there wasn't any, and that he was aware of. And he says also, well, Ireland was a bit behind the times when it came to animal rights activism. Well, I knew that not to be true because I'd already been doing this other research. It's like, actually, Ireland was doing a lot of amazing stuff. And I did come across one book I was documenting direct action on hare coursing, where they would go out and throw glass and tacks and stuff on the fields to disrupt the races. Although it's now been suspected that perhaps it wasn't the activists doing that, but the people who own the race course, so that they could create their counterclaim and be taken a little bit more seriously, exaggerating what the animal rights activists do, which is a tactic that they do. But anyway, I didn't have much to say on it in the book. But after the book came out, this guy named Mark Fitzpatrick got in touch with me. He says, actually, there was a lot going on. There's a huge history of people doing direct action in Ireland, and they still are doing it to this day. So I'm very pleased. I think he's working on a book to document this lost history. So keep an eye out for that. I think also Ronnie Lee is serving as a reviewer for it. So filling in that gap. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of wet your whistle, I guess, on what kind of amazing things that Ireland has been doing that's been lost to history. And I think one of the things that we can do moving forward as a vegan community, as an animal rights group, is to be thinking about this history and, you know, having it as a way of empowering us. Because I think that one of the things about animal rights work is it's very depressing sometimes, because it feels like we're not making any movement, and how can these horrible things still be going on? But I think knowing this history, this rich legacy of people who came before us, who are doing this hard work in places that we're told have not had that history, I think this is very important for us to keep in our back pocket. So with that said, kind of getting us a little bit excited about what people are doing to kind of fight the oppression, let's now back it up a little bit and think about how that oppression came to be. Because one of the things about animal rights in Ireland I want to highlight is that animal rights takes on a different form, or it's a different context in Ireland, because Ireland, Britain's first colony, this is a post-colonial space, colonized for hundreds of years. What does it mean then when we have speciesism there, and what is veganism going to look like, and a total liberation strategy going to look like? So we have to think about not using just the United States and Britain all the time as our go-to for understanding how to navigate successful animal rights strategies, because Ireland is a wonderful case study in how actually colonial politics is very important for how those strategies will play out. So I'm going to back it up to the beginning here and talk a little bit about what Ireland may have been like before British colonization. And I'm making the argument here that Ireland, like many cultures of the world, was traditionally very animistic. This is something we see, you know, right across, you know, most cultures. I really can't think of any that don't have this sort of animistic history if you go back far enough. So the idea is that non-human animals aren't just other than us. They're our neighbors. They are community members in a way, much more equal. And I'm not here to say that this was some kind of vegan Eden utopian. It surely was not. When Ireland was first colonized by humans, the domestication was already in place. So when Irish people became Irish, when they came to Ireland, people first came there, they brought domesticated animals with them. So there was already that kind of baseline logic of non-human animals are not quite equal to us anymore, because domestication is one of the most classic ways of ensuring domination and creating human supremacy. It's a system of control. But when we're looking back thousands of years ago, Ireland was much more animistic. Certainly with the coming of the Celts, there was a really rich animistic culture there as well. Looking at archaeology, and I've looked at quite a few archaeological studies. If you're interested in these, if you pick up my book, the back of citation after citation after citation on, you know, what we think the role was of non-human animals in human societies in Ireland. Hunting was very limited. Slaughtering was also very limited. This was a dairy-based society. This was a cattle-based society, but not big meat eaters. And so the archaeological records are finding that actually Irish people were mostly vegetarian, believe it or not. Cows are very, very important. They were still objectified. They were still treated, they were the currency. And this lasted from well into the British colonialism, incidentally. But certainly back in the day, cows were economy, and they were much more valuable alive. So really, animals weren't slaughtered until they were older and they weren't productive anymore. But it's also interesting because Ireland, if you look around, there's still all these old stone forts. And there's lots of theories on what those might be. But one of the theories is that those are all cattle forts. The ring forts there to contain cattle. And so all those hundreds of ring forts have still remained to this day. There's this legacy of how the Irish landscape has been shaped, literally shaped by this early relationship with other animals. Even Irish bodies have been shaped by that relationship with other animals, because this is about the time you start to see that human beings can digest milk, lactose, beyond the age of weaning. Because Ireland, of course, like other Northern European countries, it's not always conducive to growing plants all year round. And so there was this need to kind of supplement their calories, their nutrition, by drinking breast milk of another species beyond the age of weaning, so beyond the age of 2 or 3 or 4. So actually the genetics of Irish bodies began to change. And so this is really fascinating as well. It's like who we are as people, the land that we live on is shaped by these really old relationships with other animals.
Excuse me, Corey, I'm really sorry to keep interrupting, but I think there's someone who's trying to get into the Zoom and needs to just be let in by you, since you're the host now.
Oh, I'm not co-hosting?
No, you're just the host.
Okay.
Do you see at the top of your screen?
All right, I'll keep it open so I can watch if I can.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Just make sure they get in.
Exactly.
All right, I'm setting up my second screen so I can keep the chat open. If it turns on, does it turn on? Okay, anyway, I'll try to remember to pop back in. Okay, so then obviously when we move into the pre-modern era, British colonization is set in, and now we see a shift in Irish economy. It's now very much so meat and dairy based economy, and this is one where this exported for Britain, it's exported for the British colonies. So Ireland actually serves an outsourced feedlot, because to consume, as we know, as vegans in the room, to consume non-human animal products, it's extremely resource intensive. It takes a crap ton of land, lots of energy to create the food that they're going to eat, space to grow the food, water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so Britain is not a very big place. And as it expands as a world power, it needs to feed its industrializing cities. It needs to feed its colonies. And so now Ireland looks like a very convenient place just across the way that we can move all the Irish people out of the way and bring in cows and sheep for this British food system. So what happens then to people who are pushed off of those lands and these land clearances? That creates an intense vulnerability. Because if you no longer have access to your land, you're now dependent upon, you know, getting it somewhere else, getting it through the British system, getting it through the little plots of land that you have available to grow potatoes. And of course, very famously, there's a dependence on the potato, because the potato could be grown in these less than desirable places, not as useful for cows and sheep. And that creates a lot of food insecurity. So what we have before that, when we have Irish people who are living off the land and communal lands, people who have rich food knowledge, eating lots of fruits, berries, vegetables, wild herbs and plants, nuts. That was another one. You see a lot of that in the archaeological records. Hazelnuts was a big part of the Irish diet. All that gets swept away. People are removed from the land and they lose that knowledge and they lose access to the land that they need to make a living. So what happens then is we have this wonderful sort of Gaelic vegetarianism, where again, milk and cheese was a small part of the diet, but it was mostly vegetarian. And now we're seeing that rich, healthy vegetarian diet is being replaced with a very precarious colonial vegetarianism, where people are eating most of their calories are coming from potatoes, and some vitamins from cabbage, a little bit of eggs, or a little bit of milk if they could get a hold of it. Which again, these are expensive items because you need the land to have that, to be able to make that happen. So people's diets suffered considerably after that. So this is a wonderful legacy of vegetarianism and near veganism in some cases, now being replaced with a high precarity with their diets and a lot of food insecurity, as we know, with the multiple famines that took place. And of course, this didn't go unnoticed, because when you move people off their land and you are obviously creating a lot of vulnerability, and people are not healthy and they're not getting enough to eat and they're not getting a correct, varied diet, this is a terrible injustice. And so through all the various like nationalist efforts to free Ireland, people recognize that this colonization of our land for meat and dairy production, this is a major part of why we're in this vulnerable state. Some people actually even advocated vegetarianism, so that there could be a liberation of Irish people. Unfortunately, that's not the way Ireland went. It kind of doubled down on that, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. But the other issue here is that we have an animalization of the Irish people themselves. So this is a very key theory, I think, when we're talking about vegan politics and colonialism, is that what happens with colonialism, inevitably, that colonialism is predicated on speciesism in some way. So if you look at the United States, Canada especially, built on the fur trade, that was what first introduced a lot of that colonialism. When you're looking at Ireland, it was to bring in meat and dairy production to feed the growing British Empire. So what happens there is twofold. First off, this is a structural change that happens to that society, but also it's an ideological change. And I think this is really key, because you've introduced a new economic system where, remember, in Ireland before, it was much more animistic. Killing animals wasn't as big a part of society as it was. Now, subjugating and killing animals is the main economy of Ireland, and it starts to saturate all aspects of culture and society. And the second part that happens there is with colonization, you see this across the board as well. The human beings that live there are also going to be animalized. So very famously in Ireland, we saw the Irish people would be simianized, made to look like chimpanzees. Sometimes they'd be made to look like pigs. There's other animals as well, but oftentimes making them look like apes or monkeys. And this was a way to say, of course, this is also, we're starting to learn more about Darwin's theory of evolution. This idea that actually Irish people, they're not fully human. They're subhuman in some way. So that makes it okay for us to do what we're doing. This justifies it. Irish people can't be trusted to govern themselves. So, and you see time and time again, when there be some kind of Irish rebellion, some kind of resistance to colonialism, you see a spike in British and American newspapers that would depict Irish people as animal-like, to show, wow, these people need to be controlled like animals, caged like animals, maybe even destroyed like animals. So we start to see, again, this is very key to this colonial understanding of veganism and vegan resistance. Is you see colonialism oftentimes is predicated on the introduction of speciesist industries, and then also the animalization of the humans there. So these things have to be considered when we're thinking about modern day forms of resistance. And I'll show you towards the end here how this actually surfaces in the 21st century. So yeah, unfortunately, although Irish folks, Irish nationalists, people who are planning the new independent republic were thinking about, well, yeah, we know agriculture is a very major part of why Ireland has been so devastated. We also have a case where this is a new country. This is a vulnerable country. They're a poor country. They've been subjugated for so many hundreds of years. Really what ends up happening is that they take the pathway of least resistance, and that is to just keep on going with this speciesist system that's been put into place. And this is what we know now. So this is also a way, and this is another kind of interesting point on colonial politics and veganism, this is also a way for them to legitimize themselves in the global theater. So we've been animalized, we've been subjugated, but let us prove to you that we're human as well by exhibiting our human privilege. So we also see this in India, for instance, after independence, Indian production of meat and dairy skyrockets. This is a way of legitimacy. China right now, although Chinese people, Asian people, by and large, cannot digest lactose, they're still becoming a major industry for dairy production. Why? Because there's this colonial sort of shame and legacy there that they're reacting to, whether consciously or not. So yeah, today we see that this has actually expanded considerably. So during the Great Famine era in the 1840s, the population of cows in Ireland were only about less than 2 million. Now we have over 6 million cows. So this has only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger since Ireland has become independent. Yeah, exports of meat and livestock. It's a major part of the GDP in Ireland. And this is not just, by the way, it's not just Ireland. I mean, Ireland gets a lot of flack because they always exceed their limits for greenhouse gas emissions because of this agriculture. But we also have to look at the EU. The EU subsidizes these factory farms. So this is something that's actually set into this kind of European system itself. So this is something that Ireland would have to reckon with as well. And this is something that Ireland has been doing. Are we actually a free, independent state when we're abiding by these European rules? I know that's a big point of contestation in Ireland. But anyway, we do know that today that Ireland, like, farmers have a lot of clout, and they have a lot of power, and they have a lot of sort of nostalgic, I guess, yeah, this nostalgic sort of romance around them that protects them as the great saviors of Ireland, that brought the people through this colonial devastation and through the terrible Civil War and all the economic hardship that came in the 1930s and all that sort of thing. The Irish farmers brought Ireland through, and that sort of reverence kind of continues today. So it becomes part of Irish tradition. I love this advertisement for Irish cheese, where even women are kind of roped into this. The Irish mammy, where mammy cooks this wonderful meat-based or cheese-based food, and that's Ireland, and satisfying the Irish man. And Ireland is also using animals not just to define Ireland, this is what we do, but also this is what we don't do. So there's some debate then about animals who are exported. So the live export industry in Ireland, of course, is a major part of the dairy industry. So by criticizing what happens to Irish cows once they go to, a lot of times these animals are sent over for religious slaughter in Islamic countries, there'd be a lot of pushback, say, well, we're Irish and we don't want our animals going to these barbaric spaces. So again, it's like a resistance to this old kind of stereotype that Irish people are less than human. So this is how you define how you are human. You are what you are. You are human, which is defined by what are you not, and you're not animal. So rising up with this sort of rising up and doubling down on eating animals, abusing animals, using animals, having entitlement to animals, but then doing it in the right way. Those people over there who are doing it in the wrong way, they're the ones who are subhuman. Because remember, even Ireland got that as well, with those early laws in the 1600s that you're abusing your animals by not farming sheep and using horses the correct way. So it's a way to make Irish people look more barbaric. So that legacy is coming up again today, with Ireland trying to define itself by what it is not. Also, there's a major attack on the traveling community, which you're probably aware of, and their treatment of horses. And I cover this quite a bit in my book as well. There's a lot of laws that are cracking down on the traveling community. And to be fair, some of the stuff that happens in horses is pretty horrible. But we also know a lot of these laws are specifically targeting traveling people. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that traveling people harken back to those old days of, the famine years and unemployment and landlessness, and people were making a living off the land. And there's some research that shows that the state of Ireland was a bit embarrassed by that. And so after the 1960s, there was a lot of legislation to kind of clamp down on the traveling community. So again, I just want us to be thinking about how this legacy of colonialism shapes Ireland and how Ireland thinks about itself today. So food, of course, is part of that. So non-veganism is kind of seen in a lot of, and by the way, a lot of this is coming from interviews that I've heard with, what's her name, Go Vegan World, Sandra Higgins. She's got many interviews on major Irish channels on the radio and television and stuff. And the responses that she gets from people in the industry, I think, are quite telling. So when she went up against the National Dairy Council on the Pat Kenny show, this idea that Irish people just become weak and wither away, they become nutrient deficient, that came up in one of the responses. Also, if people have this kind of this shared trauma of famine, this has also kind of been linked to it. this shows us how vulnerable we are. We relied on vegetables once. We don't want to go back there. And there was one interesting, I think it was a radio show that Sandra Higgins was participating in, and a caller called in and said, "But what about the famine?" and the hostess said, "What about it?" And just, it was kind of implicit there. The understanding is that we don't want to be vulnerable and dependent on vegetables ever again. Even though before British colonization, that reliance on vegetables had actually been responsible for a lot of flourishing. And there's also, I still see this popping up in the news quite a bit, this idea that vegans, this is all just kind of fake news, and it's a bunch of hoax stuff that's against the farming community. And I know that one of the recent Taoiseachs got in big trouble because he said he was interested in reducing his meat intake for climate change, and then all the farmers descended on him. So it's definitely this like legacy of Irish farmers being our heroes, but also this kind of shame and this fear, this trauma, collective trauma that came with colonialism that's shaping a lot of this response to vegan claims and climate change claims. So as I get closer to the end here, I want to kind of bring you up to date on some of the ways veganism is now being framed in Irish media today. And I do a lot of work on how veganism is represented in news. Just recently, there's Mark Fitzpatrick. There's Mark. I recently did a content analysis of British newspapers during the lockdown years, and it was really interesting to see that veganism is really popularizing, but how we talk about it is changing, and not always for the best. And I think we see similar narratives in Irish media as well. So one of the cool things that you can see here is that up until the COVID years there, veganism, mentions of veganism in the Irish Times is really, really growing. So there, if you're interested in this, and I can't give you up-to-date statistics because I don't have access anymore, but if you get a membership of the Irish Times, it allows you to do a database search. And so when I did that, I saw actually the number of vegan mentions is climbed significantly and very, very quickly. It'd be interesting to see what that looks like now post-COVID, if I may call it that. If you look at Google, also, what are the Irish folks doing? They're very interested in veganism as well. So again, this is kind of a different narrative that we're seeing when you listen to those sort of sensationalized interviews with Sandra Higgins and other vegan activists. You definitely get this more, veganism is a threat type of message. But clearly, when people are doing searches, they're looking for veganism. They're interested, and also the Irish Times is covering quite a lot. That said, there's certain themes that I'm seeing that emerge from veganism in Irish news spaces. One of these is pretty. We see this in American and British news as well. This idea that veganism is some kind of like spectacle, like this weird sideshow freak thing. So when I mentioned Jack McClellan earlier, that was a spectacle. More people, it was a circus-like atmosphere, and you can find old footage online. When he came to do a swim, kids would come, there'd be food vendors and all that. Let's see this person do this amazing thing. The Happy Pear, if you've, I don't know, they have a chain restaurant or something. I think it used to be in the airport, if not still in Dublin. They got cookbooks and food and all this sort of stuff. But when you see them in television interviews and other things, they are, to be fair, they're a bit goofy sometimes. But I think that they kind of they're portrayed as a sort of curiosity that, obviously they're twins as well. So that doesn't help because people are always gawking at twins. But yeah, it's basically this idea that, okay, veganism is getting mentions, but are we taking the seriously, their message seriously? This one you probably wouldn't be surprised based on the comments that Sandra Higgins receives in her media coverage. But we also see that veganism is considered a threat. And usually when you see veganism mentioned in these articles, news articles, say in the Irish Times, they'll say, okay, here's what the vegans are worried about. Here's what the animal rights people are worried about. And then without fail, in comes like the board BIA or the National Dairy Council or whoever to come in and just, with their authority, let it be known that we do need to eat meat and dairy, and climate change is maybe not as bad as you think it is, and this would destroy Irish economy, da 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 da. So although vegans are getting a little bit of platform, ultimately what the media is doing is protecting that legitimacy of these major speciesist institutions. And so the legitimacy of these institutions always comes through in these types of articles. We also, I know Sandra Higgins has mentioned, I think it's posted in one of her blogs sometime back, but she was one of her main things in her organization is she just does newspaper ads, bus stop ads, anything like that to just kind of bring the message out. And I'll show you one here in a moment if you're not familiar with her work. But it was rejected by Dublin Bus and Irish Rail for being overtly emotional and provocative. So again, this like threatening language is provocative. When if you've seen any of her stuff, usually it's not gory, it's not really that provocative. It's just the provocative bit is showing animals as persons. Also, National Dairy Council and some of their documents have been worried about vegans as being influencers that need to kind of work to reduce that threat. So yeah, veganism it's the idea here is that it's here and it's becoming popular, and so now there has to be some sort of response to shut it down. Veganism is terrorism is another theme that I think is very important for us to recognize, and we see this in the United States and Britain as well. In the United States, it's against the law to interfere with speciesist industries. It's actually against the law. So me as an American and a vegan, technically I'm breaking the law. The language of the law is so loosely worded, but basically it was a response to the rise of the Animal Liberation Front and other types of direct action in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. And there was a lot of lobbying by animal interests to change the wording of the law. It used to be the Animal Enterprise Protection Act or something, and they changed it to the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act. So basically labeling that, and that language is so very important. Now you are a threat to national security. When we say, so now you're not just a threat, you're a terrorist. You're against, national interests. And so again, building up on top of this narrative I've been making about how Ireland is worried about what is Ireland and how does Ireland fit into the larger global theater. So if you're against that, if you're against the farmers, you're against Ireland because you're vegan, you're doing animal rights work, I think that's very powerful language. So this is something we're seeing, again, not just the United States, also in England and Britain. You can look online and the documents that are given to people with border control to see, are these people potential threats? And I was even stopped and searched in New Zealand once for attending an animal rights conference. They pulled me aside and kept me for an hour. So that was because there had recently been a terrorist attack when I had gone to visit. So they just lumped me right in with a potential terrorist. So we're seeing this in Ireland as well, perhaps not as powerfully as we're seeing it in the United States and elsewhere, but it is there. I think Roger Yates has written a book chapter on this. It's getting a bit older now, so I'd like to see what it's like up to date. But we do know that in Ireland, like there's a lot of police resistance, and that's something that activists are concerned about. I've definitely seen Go Vegan World. Sandra Higgins' work been described as the work of ISIS or militant. So this particular image here is one of her posters, and that was described on a radio show as being militant. What is militant about that? I'm not quite sure. There's barbed wire at the bottom. I know it's a cow. Like, I don't know. Like the dairy industry took her babies and now it's going to take her life. That's just speaking truth. So it's just interesting how that language, that rhetoric of, this is militant, this is terroristic. It's interesting how that can be used as a very powerful counter narrative. We also see this theme happening quite a bit in Ireland and in Britain and also in the United States, is that farmers feel attacked. They feel like the activists are threatening them. We don't have any record at all of an animal rights activist ever killing another human for activist purposes, although we have the reverse that is true. People here in the UK, for instance, have been killed and severely assaulted. It's still happening today. But anyway, we often see that kind of narrative used in the media to portray us, again, to exaggerate that we're this terrible threat and when we need to be dealt with, I suppose. Definitely not taken seriously. So those are the sort of the scary ones. But I think one of the most important ones, if I had to highlight any of these new things for us to look out for in the media in Ireland, is now just reframing, depoliticizing veganism as just a diet. So when I was talking about my British one that I just completed, the overwhelming majority of the articles that were featured in British newspapers was to frame veganism as a diet or it's about stuff to buy. Only one article I found out of over 400 actually talked about centered animal rights messaging. And the same thing is also happening in the United States, and it's also happening in Ireland. So this is something that we need to be aware of. Although veganism is popularizing, it tends to be completely devoid of animal rights. So this is just a diet, a new exciting type of lifestyle or whatever, things to try, things to purchase, things to consume, subscribe to, etc. And it's just basically falling in line with, the capitalist sort of system and not really challenging speciesism at all. Sometimes I think what's unique about Ireland as well is that you oftentimes see the vegan stories mentioned in newspapers associated with trendy restaurants or travel. And I think that's really interesting from the Irish perspective because it's really exotifying it, like, oh, these new amazing places out there somewhere. And again, this may also reflect that Ireland has kind of been stereotyped over the years, as has Britain, not being the best for cuisine. And it really wasn't until, gosh, I think the 1980s that we started to see Irish cuisine starting to take its own thing, where we have celebrity chefs and cooking shows, etc. So I think this is kind of the thing to pay attention to. Do we really want to frame veganism as something other and out there and exotic, when we actually know that in Ireland we have this rich history of vegan food, of plant-based eating, long before British colonization wiped out traditional food knowledge and moved all the people off the land to fill it up with cows and sheep on death row. So I think that it's really interesting that we're seeing media curious about veganism, but I think we should be a little bit critical of the idea that it's something different, other, weird, exotic, and non-Irish, because actually one of the goals that I had for this project, this book, is to think about veganism and animal rights not as something other that was brought in, but actually this is something indigenous to Ireland. Plant-based eating is a major part of Irish history that's been forgotten and really squashed, I think, by this sort of romanticization of farmers and, the great independence of Ireland and all that, which is, great. Farmers are important. They're definitely important for Ireland's survival and to flourish. But unfortunately, that flourishing has been linked to, we need to oppress non-human animals and eat non-human animals in order to flourish, which we know is actually not the case. Some of the top killers are based on, non-vegan consumption, and of course, climate change is here, and Ireland is a major contributor to that. And then we're seeing with recent storms and flooding and other things that, starting to feel the repercussions even in the British Isles. So I think what is interesting here is this opportunity to reimagine, remember these older plant-based food systems that are indigenous to Ireland, and not just see veganism and animal rights as something other people have done that we're bringing in, but actually Ireland has something unique to contribute to this growing movement. So veganism, we know, is here to stay. It's only growing in popularity, as I showed you in these charts, as more and more people are curious about it. So here's an opportunity for Irish activists to think about, what can we contribute to this narrative? How can we make something unique and actually encourage people who are traditional, people who never could have imagined drinking oat milk or, eating vegan? How could they see this in line with what they already do, or how they feel as an Irish person? We know there's a lot of successful campaigning in Aldi and other supermarkets, how they say buy Irish. Can we also tap into that for vegan products? We're starting to see a little bit of that happening. Oat milk is exploding, right? And so even board bia, the very traditional meat and dairy board bia, is starting to say, actually, farmers, pay attention, because oats are going to be really important. And by God, Irish people do oats well, right? Also the seaweed industry, mushroom industry. There's a lot that Ireland can contribute. And then, of course, remembering some of those old foodways that have been lost through time. So this is important, not just for pushing Ireland forward, but also resisting that colonialism, right? Remembering or rethinking what Ireland could be before or without that British kind of oppression, if we must call it that. So I'll leave it there. If you want to learn more about this, definitely check out my book. I'm not at all opposed. If you can't afford it, send me an email. I'll send you a PDF. You can check out a lot of blogs. I have free blogs up on my website. Just click on the link about Irish themed stuff. I have a podcast where I talk about some of these themes as well. So you want it, I got it, and it's free on the internet. And I'm always happy to answer questions here, but also via email. So yeah, it's SUNY Press, not New York Press. It's SUNY Press, and I think it's like $30 or something on paperback.
Thank you very much, Corey. That was great, very informative, and really interesting. And it's great to have you here this evening. In terms of questions, I have two questions for you. Number one, I'd like to know your own personal journey, just a very small bit on that, to veganism. And the other one is, think about the group that we are, Sentient Rights Ireland, and indeed any other groups. What would you recommend in terms of strategy in getting the message out, people to go vegan, not necessarily to vote for us, because even though we are a political party, we're just using politics as a platform. It could be grassroots. So what strategies would you say are effective?
Okay, so easy question and then an impossible question. Also, before I start answering questions, I'm going to give a shout out. Mark Fitzpatrick, whose work I mentioned, is president. I think Roger Yates, I also see you hiding over there. So those are two very important Irish scholars to check out. Yeah, so how did I come into veganism? I come from Appalachia, so who knows how. So that may people also asked if I have Irish in my ancestry. Probably, I don't know. I'm definitely part of Appalachia, so most people do. I just kind of got into it. I was watching a program when I was 13 years old. It was on as a gourmet cooking show, and the guy went to a butcher shop to pick up some meat for the recipe, and there was pigs' heads hanging on chains in the window. And then it just dawned on me, like, yeah, those are people, those are persons. And I said, I'm out. This is the days before the internet, so I wrote like a handwritten letter to PETA, and PETA sent me some free literature or whatever. And then I realized I need to go vegan. I don't come from a rich family. I'm definitely a low-income family, so it was really difficult for my parents with the vegetarianism. So I said, the first day I go to university, I'll go vegan. And that was 23 years ago. So I've been vegan most of my life. So the second part, I guess you call a theory of change. Well, as a sociologist, I think that the number one thing for us to pay attention to is institutional, structural level change. So I think, yeah, politics is a big part of that. I'm also majorly into education. I think that's why I went into, the university, because I have a captive audience, not just I have an animal class, but when I teach my animal class, half the people in there aren't even vegetarian. So you have a captive audience there. And a lot of people, of course, go off and recommend the class and they become vegan or vegetarian. I teach an environmental politics class and get to cover these topics. And so every semester I have a batch of young people who are going to go off into all these different fields. And so for me, that's a very important systemic level change. There's a very exciting campaign happening here in the UK that might be interesting to folks who are associated with universities. Some of my students in one of my environmental politics class last year, they started a plant-based university campaign where it's part of a larger campaign through a group called Animal Rising, where they basically, it's quite clever, they make use of the democratic channels that are available to students and student unions. And they basically create a policy change where they have students vote for it, and students can't, bless them. The campaign, it was quite stressful because the university didn't grant them the voting window until the last week of the semester in rainy old December. So they went to the library and just kind of picketed, just went to every student that they could see and asked them to support this measure. And they got 467 votes, which is more than double. It was by far more than double the number that any other campaign had ever gotten in the history of the student union. And it took a lot more fighting from there for the university of student union to uphold their promise. But basically, now they have to start transitioning all student catering to vegan. And not only that, but they have to start advocating for the student body, because that's what the students voted for, to the university to start going plant-based in general. And that to me is very important, because it's not just my University of Kent, but also other universities have already won that in the UK. And universities are important for, because we're institutions of knowledge production and we influence policy. And of course we teach students. And so I think that's an exciting way to make some real change. But other than that, like the sky's the limit. And I think it's really, really important for us to think sociologically and think about institutional level change, because unfortunately is the wrong word, but social psychology is now seeing a major increase in activist strategies about, okay, well, what's going to make each individual based on their personality make this food choice or whatever. That's important, but we need to actually look at how we're going to change the social systems to where it's not about each individual's personal choice. It's about how we make a system where it's easier to choose vegan than to not choose vegan. So that's what I think most animal rights organizations need to focus on a little bit more. Unfortunately, it's not as glamorous for when you're writing, your end of year reports and going for grants and major funding. So that's what I want to say as a sociologist. I think we should try to do the less glamorous work of institutional change. And I know it can be daunting, but that's the most important.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions, please?
I'm just reading the comments. Thanks everybody for your thoughtful words. It's really kind.
Roger has a question. Roger, can you unmute?
I can. Hi, Corey, and thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure everybody would agree with that. It was really good. I wasn't familiar at all with the Drummond reference that you gave, so I had a quick look, and it is online actually, that book, so you can get that. So that's pretty good. So yeah, I mean, I was familiar obviously with Piers Burn and the Plan by the Tail and Howard Cobb and all the rest of it. So that's the first point. The second one is the numbers. You showed those graphs. It's quite interesting because Go Vegan Ireland started in 2015, and then it became Go Vegan World in 2016, and that seems to kind of correspond with some of those numbers, which is pretty good. And of course, to plug my group, Vegan Information Project, we started in 2013. And so we were kind of doing 11 hours a week. In fact, until the pandemic, we didn't really miss a week in about 7 years. So that was pretty good. And then finally, on that thing about the threat and about they seem to be the kind of orchestrated response to veganism, there was a series of meetings by a lot of animal user industries in Ireland. And in fact, some of them were found out by the activists, and there was demonstrations outside the hotels. But ever since then, they've had a kind of almost like a script to use. One of them, for example, is, these people, they want a meatless, petless society. That was very kind of popular at first. And then, of course, now you've got a new set of kind of repeated claims based on the fact that Go Vegan World is kind of, for them, quite shocking, I suppose. So not really a question, but just some observations. But thanks terribly for the presentation.
Cheers. Thanks, Roger.
Anybody else like to say a few words?
Mark Fitzpatrick is still around. He might want to give a shout on the work he's done. So I think Roger Yates has done a lot of important work here for people. He's got a YouTube channel and I guess monthly, is it weekly, monthly show, Roger? He does a lot of the history as well. So if you're interested in this history stuff, definitely check that out. I think Mark has left.
He does the Time Tunnel on YouTube and YouTube Live with Ron Ely as well.
Sorry?
Roger does what he calls the time tunnel, the vegan time tunnel on YouTube, and he does Still Alive with Ronnie Lee. They're the two shows, they interact. And they cover topical stuff and historical vegan information as well. It's really good. And also vegan information, we've been with them a couple of times in Dublin. They do Vegan Street on Westmoreland Street now on a Sunday from 1 to 6, and that's very effective. And they've gathered more volunteers all the time.
Just on that Still Alive, Dennis, you know, we always finish the show and I always go, we'll be back next week, providing, and then Ronnie says, we're still alive. So that's always quite...
Come on.
So I don't know if anybody has any more questions, now is the time. Bridget, would you like to talk? Yeah, you have to unmute, Bridget. Unmute your phone.
Yeah,
That's-
I did listen in to some videos from Corey about over a year ago, and it was very interesting about our relationship with animals, the interrelationship between the human and animals, and our indigenous, almost vegetarian ways of living back in the day, and how the cow was more useful to be alive for the milk, as opposed to going to slaughter and all that. And I didn't realize that it was the introduction of that brought about more and more of the population, you know, the meat industry for slaughter, as opposed to just used for the milk. So yeah, I find that very interesting, and it would be a very, very good stand to take, you know, in advertising, in terms of let's go back to what we used to be, something like that. So thanks very much, Corey Lee. Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Bridget.
All right, welcome.
Well, if see, there's more information coming in on the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Corey. This is Timothy, by the way, trying to steal the show upstage. So I'm not sure if we have any more questions. If there is, now is a good time to ask.
And can I say also, if you come across any interesting history or you have any other contributions, it's one of the cool things I've found is since I've put this book out, lots of people have emailed me and said, did you know about this? Or, you know, and it's really interesting to learn more from people, because obviously I don't live in Ireland. I only lived in Ireland for about a year and a half. So there's going to be intricacies that I'm not aware of. So I do know, like, what is the forum? I can't remember. There's like some forum in Ireland that almost every Irish citizen is a member of. It's like a chat board. Do y'all remember what that is?
Well, there's a citizens committee set up from time to time that report to government. Then there's Stop Climate Chaos. There's a lot of community groups involved.
This is just a generic one that everybody was on. I can't remember the name of it anymore, but I went on there and asked if anybody had relatives from some of these people. These like
Women's Association. Something
what,
like that.
Irish country women?
Yeah, the ICA.
So I was just, I would love to get in touch with some of the, like.
We could do a search to one of the genetic groups that are around, the Czech ancestry, the ancestry groups, they might have it.
Yeah.
If they're Anglo-Irish, the UK might be the place to check as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Corey, if I just butt in again, you know, McClellan, was he the one who was on the 1976 Open Door, the Vegan Society thing? Because there was an athlete on that, but I think it might have been a different one, which goes to show this kind of idea of athletes being plant-based is nothing new, really.
You know, I've not actually watched that. I watched the beginning and it was so, I turned it
Oh,
off.
I know.
I don't have to do it.
Yeah, it is worth it, especially when you get to the Bland family. They've actually got a family called the Bland family. And it goes to show how they weren't really media savvy in those days, because somebody would have gone up and go, maybe change your name for the show.
In terms of McClellan, Corey, my Auntie Mary was married to McClellan from Omagh, which is in Northern Ireland, her own. So I don't know if we're related, but maybe maybe it has jumped over, transplanted into the genes here. I don't know. I'll certainly check it out.
Now, was it actually, I gave a talk similar to this for the Irish Humanist Association, and the guy who runs it was a long distance open water swimmer. And he didn't know about him either. It's like, for Pete's sake, this like this amazing person. He was a celebrity back in the day, and he's just forgotten. Well, I won't bore you anymore with my rambling, but if anyone is interested, again, check out my website. There's tons and tons of stuff on there, and I'm always happy to get emails.
Okay, well, will we call it a wrap so and say good night to everybody and thank everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Corey. We'll edit and we'll put it up, and any supporting material that you'd like on the YouTube with it, and we'll give you your
Just a reminder though, Dennis, I think Corey's got to stop the recording in the way that she started it.
Yeah, I have it here.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Corey.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much, Corey. Great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.